I remember sitting on that couch, the house still filled with flowers and sympathy cards from the funeral. My hands were still shaking from placing dirt over my parents' graves just days earlier. I thought Michael was calling me over to comfort me, maybe to tell me we would get through this together. Instead, he placed a stack of papers in front of me like I was in a business meeting. He didn't even look sad. His tone was flat and cold when he said, "Either transfer the company to me, or we file for divorce." At first, I thought I misheard him. I laughed a little because I was sure it was some sick joke. But he didn't smile. He just crossed his legs and stared at me like I was some stranger standing between him and a prize. My chest tightened. I asked him why he was doing this. He shrugged and said, "You can't run something that big on your own. It makes more sense if I take control. You'll still be taken care of." Taken care of. As if I was some child who needed an allowance. I reminded him that this company wasn't just money. It was my parents' life's work. They had started it in our garage. I grew up watching them work nights, traveling across states just to secure contracts. He knew all of this. He had heard every story. He had sat at their table and called them mom and dad. Still, he pushed the papers toward me again. His voice got sharper. "Sign it. Don't make this harder." I stared at his face, trying to find the man I married. The man who cried with me when I lost my first pregnancy. The man who held my hand when I broke down in the hospital. But all I saw now was someone who had been waiting for this moment. Someone who didn't see me as his wife anymore, just a path to power. I told him I couldn't sign anything. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just stood up and said, "You have until the end of the week. If you don't transfer it, I'll drag you through court. And trust me, I'll make you look unstable. People will believe me. You've been emotional lately." That was the moment it all clicked. He wasn't reacting out of stress or confusion. He had planned this. Probably long before my parents even died. Maybe he had been waiting for them to go. Waiting for me to be weak enough to control. After he left the room, I sat there for hours. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just went numb. I realized I wasn't just grieving my parents anymore. I was grieving my marriage. The man I thought was my partner had turned into my enemy overnight. But something inside me hardened. If he wanted a fight, he was going to get one. Not with tears. Not with begging. I was going to answer him the way my parents taught me, with strength, silence, and strategy. My grief would not be his weapon. It would be my fuel. I sat there listening to him, still trying to understand how he could say those words with a straight face. He leaned back like he was being reasonable, like this was just common sense. He said things like, "Be realistic, Emily. A woman handling a $250 million company alone? It's not practical." He even tried to soften his voice, pretending he was doing me a favor. "Let me take care of the business side. You focus on healing. It's what's best." But I could hear what he really meant. "You're too weak. You're not capable. Hand it over." The more I stayed quiet, the bolder he became. He reminded me of times he had supported me. He brought up old memories as if they were receipts. When you were depressed after the miscarriage, who was there? When you wanted to quit your job, who pushed you to keep going? "I've invested in you. Don't act like I haven't earned this." Invested. Earned. He was talking about our marriage like it was some kind of loan agreement. I wasn't his wife anymore. I was his return on investment. I told him none of that meant he was entitled to my parents' legacy. That's when his mask slipped a little. His voice turned cold. "Don't be ungrateful. Without me, you wouldn't even be stable enough to run your own life, let alone a company. You owe me." That word, "oh," kept echoing in my head. How could someone I loved so deeply believe I was in debt to him just for being my husband? Isn't marriage supposed to be partnership, not leverage? I tried to explain that I had no problem including him in decision. I wasn't shutting him out. I just wasn't handing over full control. But he didn't want partnership. He wanted possession. He stood up and walked toward the window like he was thinking about something big. Then he said, "Look, I'm trying to do this peacefully. I could make this ugly if I wanted to. But I'm asking nicely. Sign it willingly, and we'll move forward without drama. Refuse, and I'll make sure everyone knows you're unstable and unfit. People already see how emotional you've been lately. They'll believe me." That was his real strategy. Not just legal pressure, mental pressure. He wanted me to doubt myself, to think I couldn't win, to think I needed him to survive. For a moment, I almost believed it. I could feel that familiar fear rising, the kind that makes you freeze instead of fight. But then I remembered my mother's words. The moment someone tries to silence you, that's when you speak louder. I didn't scream or argue. I just stared at him until he finally looked back at me. And I said calmly, "You don't support me. You're trying to bury me." He didn't reply. He just walked out of the room. And that silence told me everything. He knew I was right. But he also wasn't done. Neither was I. A few days later, Michael suggested we go to his parents' house for dinner. He said they wanted to check on me after the funeral. I knew things were tense between us, but I assumed at least his parents would show some sympathy. Instead, the moment I sat down, I realized this wasn't a family dinner. It was an ambush. The food was on the table, but no one was eating. Richard and Susan sat stiff, watching me like I had done something wrong. Susan started with a fake soft tone, saying she understood I was confused and emotional, but that I needed to do the right thing. I asked what she meant. That's when Richard leaned forward and said clearly, "Michael has stood by you for years. He earned that company by staying married to you." I froze. Earned? By staying married? As if being my husband was some charity job that required payment? Before I could respond, Susan chimed in again, but this time with a harsher tone. She said, "You're being selfish, Emily. You should be grateful you have a man willing to take such a big responsibility off your shoulders." They spoke to me like I was a burden, not a partner. Like I was too clueless to understand what was best for me. I looked at Michael, expecting him to step in or at least calm things down. But he just sat there, arms crossed, watching like it was a show he had paid for. That's when it hit me. This wasn't spontaneous. He had already told them everything. He had prepared them. They were working together. I tried to defend myself, saying the company wasn't a prize to hand out. It was my parents' legacy, their blood and sweat. But Richard cut me off, saying, "Legally, it's marital property now. If you don't give it willingly, he'll get it eventually anyway." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. They didn't just want control. They expected it. They believed it was their right. Susan even tried guilt-tripping me, saying, "Do you think your parents would want you hoarding everything while your husband carries all the responsibility?" I almost laughed at how twisted that was. My parents respected independence. They raised me to be strong. They would never want me manipulated like this. I stayed calm. I didn't shout. I didn't break down. I simply placed my fork down and said, "If you all think I'm so incapable, then you never respected me to begin with." No one replied. They just stared. I stood up, thanked them for dinner even though I hadn't eaten a bite, and walked out. Michael didn't follow me immediately. He stayed behind, probably to continue whatever strategy they were building. When he finally came home later that night, he acted like nothing happened. He asked if I wanted tea before bed. That was the scariest part, how normal he made betrayal look. That's when I finally accepted the truth. I wasn't part of their family. I was part of their plan. After that dinner, I went home and sat alone in the dark, replaying every moment from our marriage. Suddenly, things I had ignored before started making sense in a different way. Small things I once saw as harmless now felt like warnings I had missed. I remembered how Michael always questioned my family's lawyers. Whenever they visited or called, he would pull me aside and whisper things like, "You know they only care about the money, right?" Or, "You should keep some distance. They'll try to control you through legal stuff." At the time, I thought he was just being protective. I trusted him and slowly stopped involving them in personal decisions. Now I realized he wasn't protecting me, he was isolating me. Then there were his jokes. He often said things like, "Can't wait to retire early when your old man finally kicks it." And I would hit him playfully, saying it wasn't funny. He'd laugh and say, "Relax, I'm kidding." But he said it more than once. Sometimes even in front of my parents. They would laugh awkwardly, assuming he was joking too. Now, thinking back, I could hear the truth behind his laughter. There were also times he pushed me to convince my dad to add him to company meetings or documents, even though he had nothing to do with the business. He would say, "It looks better if your husband is involved. People respect that." When my father politely kept things separate, Michael would act offended, saying, "Guess I'll always just be the outsider." I used to comfort him, telling him one day my parents would trust him more. I didn't know he was simply waiting for them to be gone so he wouldn't have to ask anymore. Even the way he reacted when I talked about learning more about the company stood out to me now. Whenever I said I wanted to get more involved, he'd say, "Why stress yourself? We're already set for life. Just enjoy things." Back then, I thought he wanted a peaceful life for us. In reality, he wanted me to stay uninvolved so I wouldn't stand in his way. It all started to connect. Every comment, every suggestion, every fake concern. It wasn't random. It was preparation. I felt sick realizing that while I was loving him wholeheartedly, he was studying me, figuring out where I was strong and where I was weak. And he chose my grief as the moment to strike. I had ignored every sign because I believed love meant trust. But now I understood something painful. Love without awareness can make you blind, and blind people are easy to lead. He thought I was still blind, but now my eyes were open. A few nights after that dinner, everything finally exploded. I was sitting in the living room, quietly going through old photos of my parents. Michael walked in without saying a word and dropped a thick stack of papers on the coffee table, hard enough to make me jump. His face was completely different, cold, stiff, like he was done pretending. He pointed at the papers and said, "That's the final agreement. I'm done waiting. Either sign it now, or pack your things and leave with nothing." His voice wasn't raised, but it was sharp enough to cut through me. I asked him why he was doing this to me when I was already hurting. He rolled his eyes like I was being dramatic. He leaned closer and said slowly, "I'm not repeating myself again. Sign it, or I will drag you through court. And if we go to court, I'll make sure you look unstable. You've been crying for weeks. Everyone will believe you're not mentally fit to run a company." I could feel something inside me snap, but not in a loud way. It wasn't anger that made me stand up. It was clarity. I looked at him and realized that this man didn't love me anymore. Maybe he never truly did. He didn't see me as his wife. He saw me as a door he needed to break through. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. I just stared at the papers. My hands weren't shaking this time. I wasn't scared. Instead, I felt strangely calm. He mistook my silence as weakness and smirked, thinking he had already won. I looked up and said quietly, "If you want to fight, you'll get one. But don't expect me to play by your rules." He narrowed his eyes and scoffed. "You don't even know how to fight me. You're not built for this." That was the last thing he said before walking away, thinking he had defeated me. But he was wrong. Up until that moment, I had been reacting out of pain. I had been emotional, lost, drowning in grief. But now something shifted. I wasn't just the grieving daughter or the betrayed wife anymore. I felt like someone new was waking up inside me, someone my mother raised to stand her ground, someone my father raised to never be afraid of a challenge. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't try to talk to him again. Instead, I quietly picked up my phone and made just one call. If he wanted war, I was ready to fight in silence, and I was going to make sure he never saw the final blow coming. I moved quietly. I knew anger would make me rush and make mistakes, so I kept my face calm and focused on the work I needed to do. I called Daniel Hughes and told him everything I remembered, every strange comment, every push to cut my family out. Daniel didn't gasp or offer comfort. He asked clear, practical questions and then told me what to prepare. First, we secured every important paper. Daniel told me to gather originals: my parents' wills, trust documents, company charters, past meeting minutes, and any signed contracts. I drove to my parents' home office and took careful, untouched copies. I made a list of who had access to bank accounts and who handled payroll. Names that had seemed harmless before suddenly mattered a lot. Next, Daniel recommended a financial sweep. We hired an independent accountant who understood corporate audits. The accountant began checking transfers, looking for unusual withdrawals, new payees, or changes in account signatory. We found small, suspicious transfers that had been hidden among regular expenses, not enough to be obvious, but enough to show a pattern. That was important. Patterns make a case. We also talked to people who knew the business. I reached out to 3 longtime employees my parents trusted: a plant manager, an old contract lawyer, and the head of operations. I asked them, plainly, if anything odd had happened recently: new instructions from Michael, requests to change vendors, or unexplained meetings. Their answers were matter of fact. Some of them admitted Michael had been asking questions and trying to get involved more than seemed normal. They agreed to write down what they remembered and to be available if needed. Daniel suggested we preserve evidence immediately. We saved emails, text messages, and voicemails that mentioned the company or the inheritance. We printed bank statements and took screenshots of any online changes. Daniel warned me to avoid deleting anything or deleting conversations. That could look suspicious. So I kept everything exactly as it was. We also made legal moves to protect the company while we investigated. Daniel filed paperwork to put a temporary hold on certain asset transfers and asked the company's long-trusted director to call an emergency board meeting. This was done quietly so Michael wouldn't have time to move assets. The goal was simple: stop any quick theft before it could happen. During this time, I stayed outwardly fragile. I cried in front of people when it seemed necessary, but behind the scenes I met with Daniel every day. We mapped out possible legal claims, including breach of fiduciary duty and undue influence. We talked about how to prove intent without relying only on emotion. Facts win in court. Finally, Daniel reminded me about safety and reputation. He advised against public statements and told me to keep the circle very small. Only trusted staff, and my lawyer knew the full plan. That restraint kept our strategy strong and our position unexpected. By the time Michael realized I was fighting back, we already had a structured case and a team ready to act. I was still grieving, but I had also become deliberate. The work I did quietly then would later turn the tables. I waited until everything was in place before making my move. One morning, while Michael was eating breakfast, I walked in with a tired expression and said softly, "Fine. I'll sign. I'm done fighting." He looked surprised for a moment, then pleased, like he had finally broken me. I kept my voice shaky and added, "But I want it done properly, in front of lawyers and witnesses. I don't want any confusion later." He didn't hesitate. He thought I was surrendering. He smirked and said, "Finally making a smart decision. He immediately called his lawyer and arranged everything for the following week. He even booked a conference room in a fancy downtown building and asked his parents to attend. It was clear he wanted this to look like a public victory. He even told me, "You'll thank me one day for taking responsibility." I acted quiet and obedient. I didn't argue. I didn't question anything. I showed up to the meeting in simple clothes, looking small and defeated. Meanwhile, Michael arrived in an expensive suit, polished shoes, and a confident grin. He greeted everyone like a man about to receive an award. His parents came too, dressed proudly, whispering to each other like they were watching history unfold. What they didn't know was that Daniel had already set everything up on our end. There were neutral attorneys present, not just his. There was also a court reporter ready to record every word. The documents he thought I was signing were not submission papers. They were legal evidence packets, containing audio recordings, bank statements, transfer logs, and statements from employees. I sat quietly at the table while the lawyers handed out the papers. Michael didn't even bother reading them. He just flipped to the signature page and pushed a pen toward me like he was handing treats to a pet. "Go ahead," he said, tapping the paper. That was the moment Daniel spoke. "Before Mrs. Carter signs," he said calmly, "I'd like Mr. Reed to confirm, in front of all witnesses, that he demanded full transfer of company ownership in exchange for avoiding a forced divorce." The room froze. Michael frowned, confused. "What are you talking about? This is just standard procedure." Daniel continued, slightly louder. "So for the record, Mr. Reed, did you threaten to publicly defame my client and claim she was mentally unstable if she refused to surrender her inheritance?" Michael's eyes widened. His mother shifted uncomfortably. His father whispered something under his breath. Michael tried to laugh it off. "This is ridiculous." That's when Daniel opened a folder and pressed a button on a small speaker. Michael's own voice filled the room. "Sign it or I'll destroy you in court. I'll make sure everyone thinks you've lost your mind." No one moved. Michael turned pale. His parents looked like they had been slapped. He opened his mouth to talk, but no words came out. He had walked into what he thought was a win. But it was a trap, and the door had just slammed shut. The room changed in a second. Conversation stopped, and a heavy silence filled the air. People shifted in their chairs, eyes moving between me and Michael. He stared at the table like someone who had been punched. I could see his jaw working, trying to form words that wouldn't come out. One of the lawyers leaned forward and asked calmly for explanations about the bank transfers and the contracts I had handed over. The accountant who had helped us pointed to lines on a printed statement and explained, in plain terms, how money had been rerouted and how signatures had been altered. The director of the company, who had been invited to the meeting, closed the folder, looked at Michael, and said, "We need to freeze these accounts immediately." Michael scrambled. He tried to deny what the documents showed, blaming clerical errors and claiming he was being framed. His voice got louder, then shaky. His parents sat very still. Susan's face had gone pale and Richard's hands were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. Every denial he made only made him look worse because the papers and numbers lined up like a trail. Someone from the legal team asked Michael directly if he had attempted to change signatory rights without board approval. He stammered and avoided eye contact. Another lawyer quietly said we would need sworn statements from witnesses and immediate access to the company's internal system. They explained the process in simple terms: temporary injunction to stop transfers, a forensic audit, and expedited court filings if necessary. The language was dry, matter-of-fact, but it meant action, and it meant Michael's plan was unraveling fast. Michael rose and started pacing. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. He tried to make a scene, calling me a liar, but the room wouldn't be drawn into his theatrics. The court reporter kept typing. Every angry accusation he shouted went into the record. A security guard, called by one of the lawyers, stepped closer to the door as a precaution. Michael made one last desperate attempt to appeal to his parents, but they didn't answer him. They were silent and distant, their support visibly gone. When it ended, the lead attorney outlined the next steps and spoke directly to me. They recommended filing emergency motions that afternoon and arranging a full board meeting within 48 hours. They also suggested notifying the bank to place holds and instructing the company's IT team to preserve all data. I felt oddly calm even as my heart pounded. Everything I'd prepared was now in motion. On the drive home, I watched the city pass by and let the reality settle. I had come to that table as a woman protecting her parents' work, and I left as someone with a legal team ready to act. I knew there would be a painful public fight ahead, and that trust in our marriage was gone forever. But I also knew one thing clearly. The company was safe for now, and every lie he had relied on was exposed in front of witnesses who could testify. When I walked back into my house later that night, the silence felt different. It was no longer empty. It was steady, like the calm after a storm. I had expected relief, but all I felt was resolve. The rest would be handled by lawyers and facts. My job was to stay steady and see it through. The days after that meeting were loud and quiet at the same time. Loud with legal calls, court notices, and endless paperwork. Quiet in the way Michael's side went completely still. His parents, who had once cornered me at dinner and lectured me about doing the right thing, were suddenly silent. They didn't reach out. They didn't defend him. They didn't even check if I was okay. They were too busy protecting themselves. Their names were listed in the investigation as co-conspirators, since they had clearly pushed for the transfer and supported Michael in trying to take control of the company. When they realized they could be held legally responsible, they turned their backs on their own son. Susan released a statement through her attorney claiming she was unaware of the full situation. Richard avoided all contact. Just days before, they had been telling me I was selfish. Now they were pretending they had nothing to do with it. Michael lost his job first. His company didn't want to be associated with someone facing fraud accusations. Then his friends started distancing themselves. Some blocked his number. Others acted like they had no idea what happened. The same people who once praised him for being supportive husband of a wealthy heiress disappeared the moment his power faded. He tried calling me. He sent long messages saying he acted out of pressure and that he just wanted to secure our future. He asked if we could just sit down and talk like adults. I ignored him. When he showed up at my house unannounced, I didn't open the door. I just watched through the window as he stood there, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. A few days later, he finally caught me outside the courthouse. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked desperate. He said, "Emily, please. We can fix this. I made a mistake. I still love you." I stood straight and looked him in the eye. My voice was steady when I said, "You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. You chose money over love. Now live with it." He opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, but nothing came out. He realized there was nothing left to say. He wasn't my husband anymore. He was just a man who gambled everything and lost. Watching him walk away wasn't satisfying or joyful. It wasn't like in the movies where the villain gets punished and the hero celebrates. It just felt final. Like closing a book I never wanted to read again. The truth was simple. He thought he could break me by taking everything I had. But instead, he destroyed himself trying. With the storm finally behind me, I focused on rebuilding not just my company, but myself. I didn't sit around feeling like a victim. I poured all my energy into growing the business my parents trusted me with. I hired new teams, improved production, and expanded into international markets. Within a year, profits doubled. Every decision I made wasn't just for success. It was to honor my parents' legacy the right way. But there was one more thing I needed to do. I kept thinking about how easily I could have been trapped, how many other women probably went through the same kind of manipulation when they were at their weakest. So I made a choice. Instead of giving Michael half my life, I gave half the company's yearly profits to organizations that help widows and single women who were financially abused or pressured by partners after losing someone. I wanted them to know they weren't alone, and they didn't have to stay silent. People started calling it charity. I didn't see it that way. To me, it was justice. It was rewriting the ending of my own story and helping others rewrite theirs. I didn't need to destroy Michael to win. I didn't need to watch him suffer or keep checking what happened to him. My victory was simple. I stood back up. I didn't bend. I didn't hand over what wasn't his. The best revenge wasn't taking something away from him. It was becoming someone he could never touch again. Now, whenever people ask me how I survived betrayal from the person I trusted the most, I tell them this. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is not fight back with anger, but rise so high that the ones who tried to break you have no choice but to look up and choke on the sight of your success. And that's exactly what I did.